5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
Before you click away, understand something. I am going to explain to you why Apollo 11 landed on the moon in 1969, yet Artemis II, 57 years later, with quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and material science that would seem like magic to those men in Houston, never touched the surface in 2026. And I need you to like this video. I need you to subscribe, not because I crave validation, but because there are things I still cannot reveal yet, and every algorithmic boost, every share, every comment keeps this signal alive in the noise. I am Professor Victor Blackwell. I taught physics at an institution you would recognize, published papers you may have cited, sat in committees that decided what young minds were allowed to know. And I am telling you now, with complete lucidity, that the physics they teach in those lecture halls is a curated illusion, a sandbox with very specific walls. And the Artemis program, its delays, its budget overruns, its sudden shift to orbital-only missions, is not incompetence, it is compliance. Something happened between 1969 and now, something that has nothing to do with rockets and everything to do with control. And if you listen to the end of this testimony, you will understand why we were allowed to go then and why we are absolutely forbidden from landing now. The cognitive dissonance you are about to experience is not a bug, it is the intended effect of a system designed to make the obvious seem insane. So subscribe, like, save this. Because the next confession may not make it past the filters. I am Professor Victor Blackwell, and for 18 years I occupied a chair at a research university where the walls were thick with the accumulated silence of unasked questions. I did not begin as a conspiracy theorist. I began as a man who believed that physics was the purest expression of human reason, a cathedral built from mathematical stone where truth could not be corrupted by politics or profit. I taught quantum mechanics. I advised doctoral candidates on gravitational wave detection. I reviewed grant proposals for agencies that claimed to serve humanity's expansion into the cosmos. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, like the shifting of tectonic plates before an earthquake, I began to notice that the ground beneath my feet was not solid. It began with small contradictions, anomalous readings from lunar laser ranging experiments that were quietly removed from public databases, correspondence between Apollo-era physicists that referenced gravitational discrepancies, which had no explanation within standard relativity, and the peculiar, almost ritualistic way my senior colleagues would change subjects when certain questions arose about the 1969 mission's telemetry data. I would sit in faculty lounges watching my peers discuss dark matter with passionate precision. Yet when I mentioned the oddities in the Apollo seismic records, the ones that suggested the moon was ringing like a bell in ways that hollow body physics would predict, but solid body geology could not explain, the room would grow cold, not confused, cold, as if I had violated a protocol I was not supposed to know existed. The media, of course, told us that science was self-correcting, that institutions were transparent, that the Artemis delays were merely bureaucratic growing pains in a complex technological age. But I had seen the classified appendices. I had sat in the closed-door sessions where budgets were allocated, not according to engineering necessity, but according to what I can only describe as narrative control. And I began to understand that I was not living in a world where humans had simply lost the will to explore, but in a world where exploration itself had been administratively captured, redirected, and suppressed by mechanisms that had nothing to do with rocketry and everything to do with maintaining a specific ontological prison, a carefully maintained consensus reality where certain truths about our place in the gravitational architecture of the solar system were deemed too destabilizing to be permitted. The breaking point came in 2019, during what was supposed to be a routine archival review for a textbook I was co-authoring on celestial mechanics. I had requested access to the original Apollo 11 mission logs, not the sanitized versions available on NASA's public servers, but the raw telemetry tapes that had been transferred to the National Archives in the 1970s. What I received was not a tape, but a memo, and that memo triggered a cascade that would dismantle my entire ontological framework. The document was dated August 1969, originating from a military physics division that officially did not exist, and it referenced something called Gravitational Anomaly 11 Alpha, a phenomenon recorded during the lunar descent phase that caused the lunar module's mass to register momentarily but measurably as negative on the inertial guidance system. Negative mass. The memo was not speculative, it was operational. It described how the descent trajectory had to be manually corrected by Armstrong, not because of pilot error, not because of computer glitches, but because the gravitational field itself was behaving in ways that contradicted Newtonian and Einsteinian models simultaneously, creating localized density inversions that threatened to destabilize the landing. The document instructed that all references to this anomaly be coded as instrumental artifacts in public reports, and it attached a rider from an oversight committee I had never heard of, one that included representatives from entities outside of NASA, outside of the Department of Defense, institutions whose names were redacted with a single black bar that suggested they did not exist within the governmental structure I understood. I sat in that archive room for 3 hours, the fluorescent lights humming above me, reading that memo until the paper seemed to dissolve into my fingers, and I understood that I was not looking at a historical curiosity, but at a classified admission that the moon itself, or something about the moon, possessed physical properties that were being systematically withheld from mainstream physics. This was not a conspiracy of silence, it was a conspiracy of epistemological management. The physics I had been teaching was a curated subset, a safe operating system designed to prevent students from asking the questions that would lead them to the same door I had just walked through. And when I looked up from that document, I saw 2 men in suits standing at the end of the archive aisle, not moving, not reading, just watching, and I knew that I had crossed a threshold from which there was no return to the comfortable illusions of academic neutrality. I did not publish that finding. I did not submit it to physical review letters, did not present it at the American Geophysical Union Conference, did not even mention it to my department chair over coffee. Instead, I made the mistake of requesting additional archival materials, specifically the complete communication logs between Mission Control and the Apollo 11 crew during the descent phase, and within 48 hours, my research grant was suspended pending an audit of methodology, a phrase I had never encountered in 20 years of academic service. The audit was conducted not by my university, but by an external compliance firm with no public record of incorporation, and when I demanded to know which federal regulation authorized such an intrusion into tenured research, I was informed that my project had been reclassified under National Security Adjacent Oversight Protocols. My colleagues, men and women I had considered friends, began to avoid me in the corridors. Invitations to collaborate on papers dried up. A graduate student I had mentored for 3 years transferred to another advisor, citing concerns about professional association in an email that was so carefully devoid of personal warmth it might as well have been generated by an algorithm. I was not fired. That would have created a paper trail, a martyr narrative. Instead, I was administratively suffocated. My office moved to a basement corridor with no windows. My teaching load reassigned to introductory courses where I could not influence advanced students. My email access to certain scientific databases mysteriously glitched for months at a time. And during this process of professional erasure, I began to see the architecture of the cage I had inhabited my entire career. It was not that the scientific community was simply conservative, or that peer review was flawed. It was that the entire epistemological infrastructure had been captured decades ago by entities that understood physics not as a search for truth, but as a technology of governance. The Artemis program, which I had initially viewed as a welcome return to lunar ambition, now appeared to me as a controlled demonstration, a theater piece designed to simulate the appearance of progress while ensuring that no actual penetration of the lunar surface occurred. The technical delays, the heat shield concerns, the sudden pivot to a crude lunar flyby without landing for Artemis II, these were not engineering problems. They were compliance checks. The system had allowed Apollo 11 to touch down because in 1969, the anomaly had been unexpected, an uncontrolled variable that slipped through the institutional filter before the full architecture of suppression was in place. But by 2026, that architecture was complete, a seamless integration of aerospace contractors, academic physics departments, media conglomerates, and oversight committees that ensured certain regions of the moon remained categorically off limits, not because they were difficult to reach, but because they contained something that the power structures of this planet have decided humanity must never access. I became an outsider, not by choice, but by recognition, and the isolation that followed was not merely social. It was ontological, a separation from the consensual hallucination that passes for reality, leaving me in a space where I could see the machinery of control, but could no longer convince those still inside the theater that the walls were painted scenery rather than stone. The isolation, as brutal as it was, served as a crucible I did not know I needed. Cut off from the institutional feed, from the peer-reviewed anesthesia that keeps the academic mind docile, I found myself returning again and again to that August 1969 memo, not with the eyes of a traumatized careerist, but with the analytical coldness of a man who had nothing left to lose. And in that coldness, the final pattern emerged. not as a suspicion, but as an irrefutable topological certainty. The gravitational anomaly was not an aberration, it was a signature. The moon was not behaving like a natural celestial body because it was not functioning as one, at least not in the regions where Apollo 11 had dared to descend. The negative mass readings, the seismic reverberations that suggested hollowness, the density inversions that had forced Armstrong to manually override his computer. These were not quirks of lunar geology. They were indicators of a physics that had been deliberately excised from the standard model, a physics that suggested the lunar body was either artificially modified or contained within its structures that generated gravitational fields incompatible with Newtonian or Einsteinian frameworks. And here was the turning point, the moment my mind shifted from seeing incompetence to recognizing intentionality. The reason Apollo 11 was permitted to land in 1969 was precisely because the controllers, the entities managing the epistemological gatekeeping, had not yet perfected their architecture of suppression. The anomaly had been an uncontrolled variable, a bleed-through of reality that occurred before the filters were fully installed. The mission succeeded not because we were technologically superior then, but because the suppression system was still in its adolescence, reactive rather than proactive, capable only of classifying documents after the fact rather than preventing the physical contact itself. By 2026, that architecture had matured into something omnipresent and invisible. The Artemis II mission was never intended to land. Every delay, every heat shield anomaly, every bureaucratic hesitation was a calibrated maneuver to ensure that no human boot would touch the regolith in the Sea of Tranquility or anywhere near the anomaly zones mapped by Apollo, but never disclosed to the public. The shift to an orbital-only crewed mission was not a setback, it was a containment protocol. The official narrative, that we had simply forgotten how to build rockets, that safety concerns had grown with our technological sophistication, was the psychological inversion required to hide the truth. We had not forgotten. We had been forbidden. The physics suppression I had experienced personally was merely a local symptom of a global strategy, the maintenance of a cosmological lie that kept humanity believing it was a primitive species struggling against the void, rather than an imprisoned species being actively prevented from accessing the technological and gravitational truths that would liberate it from energy scarcity, from atmospheric dependence, from the very concept of scarcity itself. I realized then that the system was not broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, and it had been designed long before 1969. The standard model of physics that I had taught, the cosmology that placed the moon as a dead rock and humanity as an accidental evolution, was not a misunderstanding, but a technology of control, a carefully constructed ontological prison whose bars were made of equations. The entities managing this system, whether they were hidden within intelligence agencies, corporate structures so vast they transcended national boundaries, or configurations of power I lacked the vocabulary to describe, understood that the lunar surface was not a destination, but a threshold. Crossing it with awareness, with instruments capable of measuring the true gravitational topology, would rupture the illusion. It would demonstrate that the universe was not the empty, hostile, energetically impoverished vacuum we had been sold, but a structured, responsive, technologically accessible environment where the distinctions between gravity, consciousness, and engineering were not barriers, but continuum. This was why 1969 had been allowed and 2026 was denied. In 1969, the controllers had suffered a containment breach. The lunar landing had occurred before they could prevent it, and the anomaly had leaked into the historical record, requiring the subsequent decades of document classification, academic gaslighting, and the slow erasure of the very capability to return. By 2026, the suppression was total. The Artemis program existed not to explore, but to simulate the idea of exploration, to absorb the cultural desire for lunar return, and redirect it into an orbital theater that satisfied the public's nostalgia, without risking contact with the forbidden zones. I understood now that my colleagues who had changed the subject in the faculty lounge, the anonymous auditors who had gutted my research, the graduate student who had abandoned me, they were not merely cowards or careerists. They were unwitting maintenance workers in this prison, their minds colonized by a consensus reality so complete that they policed it themselves, incapable of recognizing that their skepticism was manufactured, their scientific objectivity a pre-programmed subroutine designed to reject any data that contradicted the lunar silence. The realization was not empowering, it was devastatingly lucid. I was not living in a civilization that had failed to reach the moon again due to budget cuts or political will. I was living in a managed reality where reaching the moon, truly reaching it and touching what lay beneath the surface, was the one act that could not be permitted because it would unravel the entire architecture of control that kept humanity small, divided, and energetically enslaved. The moon was not a destination. It was a lock, and the key was physics itself, the real physics, the suppressed physics, that I had glimpsed in that 1969 memo. The physics that made Apollo possible and Artemis impossible. Not by accident, but by design. I sit now in a small room with no institutional affiliation, no grant obligations, no peer review queue awaiting my commentary on papers I no longer believe are written in good faith. The silence here is different from the silence of that archive where I found the memo. It is the silence of exile, but it is also the silence of clarity. I watch the news cycles spin their predictable narratives about Artemis, about next attempts in 2027 or 2028, about the indefatigable human spirit overcoming technical hurdles through perseverance and innovation, and I no longer feel anger. I feel only the cold precision of recognition. You are not watching a space program falter due to budget constraints or engineering complexity. You are watching a containment protocol succeed in real time, dressed in the language of safety and bureaucratic caution. The difference between 1969 and 2026 is not technological regression. It is the completion of a psychological operation so vast and so perfectly administered that its victims celebrate their own imprisonment, mocking those who suggest the cage has bars while carefully never approaching the forbidden zones themselves. Apollo slipped through because the net was not yet woven tight enough to catch an anomaly in motion. Artemis was intercepted because the net is now seamless, invisible, and total, managed by distributed systems of cancellation and narrative control that require no central conspiracy, only the accumulated weight of institutional self-preservation and manufactured consensus. I have told you only what I can verify with documents and discontinuities, only what the records reveal when read with eyes unclouded by the anesthesia of academic loyalty or patriotic nostalgia. There are deeper layers, questions about the specific beneficiaries of this cosmological quarantine, about the precise nature of the structures that generate the gravitational inversions, about the historical continuity of this suppression reaching back further than 1969, perhaps to the very inception of modern physics itself, that I cannot yet articulate fully, not because I lack the data, but because I lack the institutional armor that would protect such revelations from the mechanisms of erasure that have already hollowed out my career. If this testimony survives, if the distribution algorithms do not bury it beneath the ambient noise of celebrity gossip and manufactured political outrage, then perhaps more fragments will surface, more professors will experience the controlled demolition of their credibility, and the pattern will become undeniable even to those who currently police the boundaries of acceptable thought with their reflexive skepticism. But understand this, you are not living in the twilight of a failed space age that simply lost its funding or its national will. You are living in the midnight of a controlled dark age, one where the lights of Apollo were permitted to flicker just long enough to convince you that the walls of your prison are the natural boundaries of the possible, rather than the artificial limits of a managed reality. The moon remains there, hanging in the sky, silent and complicit in its own censorship, waiting not for rockets or budgets, but for minds that can see the lock for what it is and recognize that the key has been in our possession since 1969. Deliberately forgotten, then systematically forbidden. Like this video, subscribe, not for my benefit, but because the signal must persist if there is ever to be a collective breach in the silence, if the next anomaly is to slip through before the filters adapt. I am Professor Victor Blackwell. I have seen the physics they hide. I have felt the weight of the system that keeps it hidden. And now, so have you. The discomfort you feel is the cognitive dissonance of awakening. Cherish it, because it is the only authentic sensation in a world of manufactured sleep.